You know, sometimes I'll place a brush stroke and I immediately regret it or feel like it's too dominant. I'm celebrating World Watercolor Month with a new video every day in July. First of all, pigment, when I say the word pigment, I'm talking about paint, but I'm talking as well about how we use paint. In my palette over here, we have pure pigment. It's been dried in the palette, and if I don't spray it before I start painting, it tends to be fairly hard. And then working with that pigment is going to give me, my brush is wet, the pigment is dry. I have mostly water on my brush when I'm loosening off those first particles of pigment. And so we're gonna get some diluted color. When your color is diluted, the pigment load is lighter. And so you're gonna end up with these transparent veils of color. And I find that for the cheaper paints, student grade paint, it tends to dry quite hard. And it can be a bit of a challenge to get anything that's thick enough where the pigment load is heavy enough that it stops being quite so transparent. And so it's really quite remarkable. Once you start working up that color with your moist brush, take a little more time and a little more intention, you start to get a greater pigment load. And my first brush stroke might look something like this instead. And I would say that's kind of a mid-range of pigment. And I kind of think about it this way. If I was a paint manufacturer and I was choosing how to label my paints and what color to show them as, I would probably choose this. It's not as dark as a pure blob of pigment with almost no water. The paint is spread with that moist brush, but it's not as transparent and diluted as this. And if you really want to know a color, you want to know that whole range. I could work a little harder at getting color. Notice I haven't dipped my brush in my water yet, so I have less water on my brush this time as well. Each time I place color, I have a little less water on my brush, and that helps it be darker as well. So now I have a third level of darkness, and this is almost as dark as it's ever going to be. And this is important to recognize because you need all three of these to really get a true picture of what the color does and what you can do with that color. And then you could get to start having fun, because there's not much you can do with a color this diluted. But there's a lot you can do with these rich saturations of pigment. And the first thing I would do is I would start to encourage some movement. And this can really be fun to play with. I should mention this color is called Onat Diamond Yellow, and it's made by Rockwell Watercolors, which is a Canadian company. And I've been playing with it a lot lately. It has a yellow and a blue pigment in it. So as it's diluted, we start to get this beautiful flow and diversity and complexity of color. And you can kind of see that happening in these very wet areas. So now we're getting something different again, because I had that diluted amount of pigment. Like I said, a lot of beginners, that's what they think watercolor is going to look like, is just that little timid amount that their wet brush picks up that they put on the paper. Oh, notice how different that is. When it goes down with that first brush stroke, it's much greener here, and down here it has a lot more of a yellow feel. If somebody told me this color was called Onat Diamond Yellow and then put this brush stroke down, I would laugh. Do you know what yellow is? But as it starts to dilute, you start to really see that yellow pigment coming and starting to glow right through the painting. So that's pretty cool. And we're just going to let that color move around. So one of the first things I like to teach a beginner painter, if you were here in my studio with me, would be to get more color than you think you need on your brush. Work in this richness of color, because then you have a few more options. You have the chance to start moving it around and introducing that flow. And then when you have that ability to be a little braver with how much color you put on your brush, you can, place those rich colors on dry paper and have those nice crisp shapes. and on moist paper and watch them move. And we have some options. And working with darker pigment gives you options, and I really like that. It's important to me to be able to do more than just place that first diluted stroke, and then I'm dipping into my palette again and placing the next diluted stroke. And I don't want to move that color. I don't want to do anything with it because it's just the color I want. And it better stay that way. Whereas if I put it down too dark, well, then I can use my thirsty brush to lift it. And you know this, a damp brush can lift color and kind of sponge it up. But even more fun is bringing in some water. I'm going to use spatter this time, spatter some water on my painting. And then I start to get that movement and that freedom, and a little bit of more creative shapes are happening on the page. Pigment load can affect the shapes of our marks as well, and I want to demonstrate that. And actually I already have. Here you can see where the richer pigment was. My brush, I mentioned that my brush was drier. And so a drier brush, when you create a shape with a drier brush, that shape stays in place better. So here the paper's quite wet. You can start to see things move. On this edge, the paper's dry, so it doesn't move so much. And over here, my marks that I placed earlier were with a slightly drier brush than the surrounding area. And so we actually have an edge that looks almost like a leaf there as well. Isn't that kind of cool? That gives us a new shape. And so our pigment load, and I'm thinking about working with this richer pigment load, because it often happens with a drier brush, painting with that rich saturation of pigment onto a moist area of the paper can give us some very interesting edges. And these are unexpected things. Even now, they're hard for me to control. Even with all my experience in the many years I've been painting, things like this will often pop up and surprise me. I wasn't expecting to see that here today, and so then I get to decide what to do with it. One thing I could do with it is let it be the shape that it is, and that's kind of, like I said, it could be a leaf. I could also let it flow by bringing in, this was a drier area, that's why we have that edge, so I could bring in some moisture there. And one way to do that would be to spritz it with water and let some of that edge be softened out. Bringing in moisture also gets those pigments moving. So when you have a heavier pigment load on your paper, and I have to mention as well, those dilute colors are helpful. They support those stronger shapes of pigment. But when you have that heavier pigment load, those little granules of pigment also can move around. So I can, with my damp brush, create passages for that pigment to move. And the heavier particles just tend to sit in the texture of the paper. And the lighter ones are the ones that start to flow down the page. So then we have, and that's why we have this granulating color with the blues and yellows happening here. The different weights of the colors really play a role here. It's science. As much as I hate to admit it, I was never a very good scientist. I like nature. I don't really need to know why all those things happen the way they do. But it's all happening in front of our eyes. We're observing it, even if we don't understand it. And I just think that's really interesting. So I've added lots of water. I've softened that strong shape with a little bit of spray. And I'm going to soften this edge as well. And the heavier weight of pigment, that thicker load of pigment, is also slowing my drying time a little bit, I think. It makes sense that maybe it would hold in a little bit of more moisture than a dilute wash that is maybe going to evaporate a little bit faster. Maybe some of those pigment particles are holding some of that liquid. As I've been demonstrating here and talking about different thicknesses of pigment on your brush, different ratios of pigment to water, you've seen me use my spray bottle a lot, and I wanted to mention that as well, because that's something else we get to do when we work with pigment. I like putting down my colors too dark and maybe even a little bit too heavy, because then my spray bottle gets to play, and it does a job of moving color a lot more gracefully. And that's really fun to observe what that spray bottle can do. It can create texture. A few little droplets can start to create, I don't know if you can see that, but there's like this lovely little, that's almost like a Venus flytrap or something now, that shape. And it's full of little dots of water. And those might kind of fade away and disappear as it dries. The characteristics of the pigment have something to say about how strong that texture shows up. But I actually think we're still going to see that texture there even after it's dried. But look at how the yellow just glows out from that dark green. Those colors move at different speeds as well, I think. And let's place that Magic Wizard color in a place where we might regret it. Let's put it over here. It kind of goes down, it looks like a red, it kind of goes down as a rusty brown. We're going to place it in here. You know, sometimes I'll place a brush stroke and I immediately regret it or feel like it's too dominant. Then the first instinct is to panic and want to lift it. You can see here it's a little more diluted than over here. Again, the nuances of just having those different proportions of pigment on the page. But whenever I place a color and I'm a little anxious about it, the spray bottle can be a friend there as well. And we can start to move it and dilute it and lessen its impact. And the spray bottle does two things. It dilutes the color. We see it starting to be less dominant that way. And of course, a damp brush can also do similar things. But it also takes away any hard edges that were created by that shape. And we had a hard edge on this side because the paper was dry. But you can see the Magic Wizard color now changing as it starts to dilute. It's going to do the same over here. Let's do a little bit of movement with water. And the spray bottle we did over here. Over here, let's try adding some actual water with the brush, which can help direct the color. And now we start to see it flow and incorporate into the rest of the wash. And so that heavier pigment load gives me movement through the page. And that's another reason I like the pairing of rich color and then a little bit of flow. It really gives me options. It helps bring that color into the rest of the painting, which it's a beautiful color. Let's actually put a little bit of that color. I feel like it needs to touch this corner. I'm going to do that with a little spatter. One thing I would mention as well is, remember I was talking about that drier pigment, and I don't know if you believed me when I put that dark stroke down earlier, but it's done what I said it would do. It's created that slightly stronger edge where that thicker pigment didn't flow as much as the colors, the wetter diluted colors around it. And that's happening here too. Even though I misted this one and it's mostly disappeared, we're seeing it happen in other areas. Another thing that's really pretty with that heavier pigment load and the spray bottle technique is that some of these brush strokes that I've placed have created edges. Even though the color, I've since diluted the color, and I want to get in close so you can see that. I'm really seeing it actually right here, that the first leaf shape, it's diluted, it's flowed. I've tilted the paper so it flows downward off the page, but you can see there's a really beautiful little dark edge here, well, and here as well, where the color kind of migrated to the edge and stuck. We're really seeing it as well up in this corner. And just a little drier brush, I've got some strongly saturated pigment in that Magic Wizard color, and we're just going to see if we can't use some of that saturated pigment to make some marks that hold a little more shape. It's still quite moist in here, so we're not getting a super defined mark, but we are bringing in just some richer color. I just felt like I needed a little bit of dark green to, or the Onat diamond yellow, so to stand beside these dark magic wizard colors. Interestingly, I dropped in that water here and to see if I could create a bloom, but notice what it did instead of creating a bloom. Because of the characteristics of this particular color, it created a blue. That wash of yellow-green, the yellow rinsed away with that drop of water, and we're left with the blue. I think that's really interesting. And now that I know that, that's a strategy I can use for my paintings in future. Oh, I'm kind of excited by that. Practice working with those different dilutions of pigment. Joseph Zbukvik calls them milk, honey, and tea, where you're working with these different proportions of water to pigment. The more it's diluted, the lighter the color is going to be. I really like working with those richer hues because then I can spread them out across the page and I have more time to just play with those shapes a little bit. As my painting has started to dry, I don't like to leave the studio when I'm in this process, because it's really nice to kind of, just like I've done here, I got distracted, I moved to something else, then I come back to this damp painting and I have the chance to maybe bring in a little bit more pigment and create some shapes. That's why I like this brush. This is made by Vinci, I believe. Their Forte mottler brush, mottler, M-O-T-T-L-E-R. And it creates these little comb-like marks that are very different than anything I used to be comfortable creating. It's interesting because if I showed someone this painting, I think they'd be wondering what blue I used, and I haven't used a blue. You know, everything, all my blue is coming from this Onat diamond yellow. The other thing that happens is that burst of rich pigment. I'm going to put a big rich saturation on my brush. Look at how beautiful and bold that is right there. And watching it here, that you could, well, right now I'm learning where my paper is dry and where it's wet. And you can really see the difference in how the color moves based on that. And I'm gonna actually we'll use the spray bottle. And I'm going to back off and just put a few droplets. There we go. Just enough to soften those shapes just a tiny bit. You're going to be a little disappointed in these colors. If you're using them quite dry and just letting them sit without that moisture that lets them move, you're not going to see as much of that beautiful diversity of color as we're seeing here today. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about ordering. I don't want you to order something that you're not going to use. One more thing I'm going to try here is I've kind of been thinking about roses. This little shape here is quite large. We're going to just try dropping in another bloom here to maybe make the center of a flower. Maybe we'll bring in a little bit of shape in just by moving a damp brush, making some trails that could be edges of petals. Also maybe a little bit of saturated pigment. It might not be a rose, it's just, you know, could be. We're abstracting here, so just a hint of a flower there. Just a hint of a flower maybe here. One thing I didn't mention today as we talked about, you know, Rockwell colors is that these separating colors can be mixed. You do not have to necessarily go out and buy brand new paints in order to get some of these interesting complexities of color. The mixtures that you make, and keep an eye on your palette, because when you're mixing different colors together in your palette, sometimes after your palette has dried, you might see some interesting separations in the palette. That's why artists are always talking about how they take pictures of their dried palette because it looks like art. The colors separate as they dry. Those are good mixtures to try using a similar approach this way with those colors that really create complexities as they flow. The only problem with that is if you are mixing color with the intention that it will separate as it dries, you need to mix a fairly rich amount of pigment. When we are mixing our own colors, we use water as our vehicle to help them to mix well, and they often end up being quite diluted on the paper. So you have to mix them in quite a rich saturation, and maybe sometimes even allow some of that moisture to evaporate out so that you have that stronger pigment blend, and then you'll be able to play with some diversity in your own creative, interesting mixtures of color. And that can be a lot of fun to figure out and strategize how to mix those hues so that you have a signature color that you like to use. Okay, thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing your work in the community. Maybe this will inspire some of your own color play, working with those different levels of moisture and pigment load on your brush. Just being observant of that. So often these things, when you're just learning, happen by accident, and then you get to notice them and then strategize on how to use them deliberately in future paintings. And that is kind of how it works. So if that's what you're observing, you're on the right track, you're doing the right stuff, and you are learning and growing. This is how we make muscle memory, and that's important.